So now it's time to attach the collar. We now need to align the notches on the collar, here, here and here, to the neck edge. The centre notch on the collar needs to match the centre back on the neck edge of the dress. So to find the centre back, just bring together the two shoulder seams, and where that folds, that's your centre back. And you can put a pin in there to mark it. So make sure that your under collar is the side sitting closest to the main fabric of the dress, so that your top collar is the one that's sitting on top. So this is my centre notch on the collar, and I'm just matching that up to the centre back. And then I need to just continue pinning around, easing the collar into the neck edge. And make sure that you go around a couple of times, getting the collar sitting evenly around the neck. And because you're working with curved edges here, there's a bit of movement. So once you're happy that you have your collar all pinned nicely and carefully in place, it's time to tack the collar to the dress before we attach the facing. And you can either tack by hand or machine all the way around this neck edge. Just remember that there's a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so you want to tack within that. So now we've attached our collar, it's time to place our button loop. All you need to do is place it, and you want the loop at this stage to be facing in towards the dress and the ends of the loop to be overhanging the seam allowance. So now it's time to prepare our facings, and I have here the front facing and the back facing, and these are the neck and armhole facings. So place the facings together, right sides together, and just match them up along the shoulder seams. And I'm going to stitch along the 2 shoulder seams to create one complete facing piece. So now I have my main dress piece with the collar attached, which is just tacked around the neck edge. And here is my facing piece, which has been joined at the shoulder seams. These are both right sides, and I'm going to place them together so that I'm sandwiching the collar and the button loop between the facing and the main dress fabric. So now the facing is pinned carefully around the collar edge, it's time to do exactly the same thing around the keyhole. Just continue to pin all around the keyhole edge. So now my collar and my button loop are sandwiched between the facing and the main fabric of the dress. It's time to stitch them together. It's important to remember at this point that the seam allowance around the keyhole edge is just 0.5 centimetres, whilst around the collar edge it is the full 1 centimetres. So when I get to the other side of my keyhole edge where the button loop is, I want to just make sure that I stitch right across the button loop, catching it within the seam allowance, but also not catching my collar. So I've just folded that back and that's pinned under there. I finished my 0.5 centimetre seam allowance around the keyhole edge. Now I need to sew my 1 centimetre seam allowance around the collar edge, and I've just made sure that I've tucked the button loop away behind that pin so that I can get around the corner. So now I have stitched my collar and keyhole edge. We just need to trim all the seam allowances in order to get a really nice, neat finish. So first I'm going to trim and grade the seam allowance to the facing side of the fabric and trim the second seam allowance. Now we need to clip around the keyhole edge. I'm just pressing the seam allowance to the facing side. And this can be a bit fiddly, but just do your best. You won't get right up into the corners at the keyhole. You can finger press it before you go in with the iron, and careful not to burn your fingers. So now this is my seam allowance pressed towards my facing, and I'm just going to stitch within the seam allowance to anchor the seam allowance to the facing. And I can't get right up to the corner of the keyhole, but that's fine, I just start as close as I can. So now you can see that's a lovely understitched keyhole where the seam allowance is anchored neatly to the facing side. So on the collar edge, we want to do the same as the keyhole, except we don't need to understitch it. So we just need to trim and grade and clip around the collar edge. So now my facing is attached and I've trimmed away all the seam allowances, clipped, understitched, and I'm ready to turn the whole thing inside out and give it a good press. Now I've pressed my keyhole and my neck edges, and I've got that keyhole sitting really nice and flat. My facing is completely hidden due to my understitching on the inside of the dress, and then I can just turn my collar down and you can see a lovely, neat finish with no raw edges at all. So now it's time to do the same thing to our armhole edges. We're going to use something called the burrito method. And I'm going to roll this edge up towards the other side, rolling the whole dress, including the collar, up inside the fabric. Okay, and then once we get close enough to the facing, I can take the facing piece, flip that around the rolled fabric, and then all the way under so that my armhole edges can meet right sides together. So this is my facing and this is my main dress, and all I need to do is stitch those together. So now I have that armhole stitched together, it's time to grade, trim and clip into the seam allowance all the way around the curved edge. Okay. Now we need to unfurl our dress burrito. So to do that, carefully reach inside and just pull the rolled fabric through to the right side again, and then voila! You now have one lovely, neat armhole. So I'm just giving my armholes a good press, making sure that the facing is going to sit on the inside of the dress. So now I have everything finished around the neck and armholes. It's time to join up the side seams. So I'm going to match the back of the dress to the front of the dress, right sides together. So the important thing is to also flip back the ends of the facing pieces and match those right sides together. And then you're going to sew in one long line from the end of the facing all the way down to the end of the hem. So once I get halfway down the side seam, I'm going to reach my pocket, and I want to make sure that I'm going to enclose the side of the pocket within the side seams so that that edge is sandwiched in between the side seam. Okay, so now it's time to prepare my belt. So I have my 2 belt pieces here and I just need to match them right sides together. And then I'm going to sew around the edges of the fabric, leaving a gap at the bottom left corner so that I can turn it inside out again. So I'm just stitching around the 2 belt pieces, 1 centimetre from the edge of the fabric. And I can stitch all the way around, and if I'm leaving my needle in and pivoting at the corners. So I'm going to stop my stitching about 5 centimetres from the beginning, meaning that I've got an opening where I can pull the belt inside out again. Then I can snip off the corners and trim away the seam allowances. Okay, and now I can turn the belt inside out through the opening that I left. So now I have my belt all turned the right way out again. I can give that a good press and make sure I tuck in the raw edges of my opening. And then I can just close that opening with a couple of stitches by hand. And then it's ready to attach to the dress. I can pin it into place, and then I'm just going to attach it by hand stitching 2 buttons. And the important thing here is to make sure that you're only stitching the belt to the back piece of the fabric. Okay, so now the belt is attached with our feature buttons, and we can turn it back round and it's almost there. All that's left to do is to finish the hem. And to finish the hem, there's a 4 centimetre seam allowance. So we're going to press up the first centimetre of the seam allowance and then press up the final 3 centimetres in 2 stages, and then we'll top stitch the hem in place. I'm doing it by eye, but of course you can measure it as you go around. So once that's all pressed, it's a good idea to pop a few pins around the hem to keep everything in position. And now I'm going to top stitch the hem in place all the way around the circumference of the hem. And we're done! So here we go, one completed Mary Quant-style mini dress. I've shown you how to make the keyhole neck with rounded collar, rounded pockets and back belt. But remember that there's lots of different options in the pattern that you can try, including a pointed collar, also a necktie for the collar, a zip front, there's angled pockets, there's even a sleeve version, and you can of course omit the back belt if you don't want it. So now all that's left is for me to try this one on.